Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Gilmore. I'm going to talk to you today about laboratory training. Unfortunately, I can't make the meeting of circumstances beyond my control, etc. So let's begin. Okay, firstly about me, 40 years of lab experience, various labs all over the place, different things, paint, and so on and so forth. But 27 years managing ALS Metallurgy Assay Lab. That's still exists. Was when I started there, it was Amtech. It's a very comprehensive lab, has XRF, ICP, ICP-MS, titrators, fire assay. Everything that's done in any mineral lab anywhere is done there. Since I left there, I started my business. I now have 8 years experience in laboratory advisory services. The main focus of the business is doing lab audits, inspections, advice, potentially detailed drawings of lab layouts and so on, equipment lists and that sort of thing. So, what is training? There's two main types, induction or generic, if you want to call it that, and specific. So, the induction training is really about laboratory culture, making sure that people are operating in the correct manner. Specific training obviously refers to use of equipment and procedures, making sure that they're being carried out, the work's being carried out correctly. And generally, we find that the training is assigned to experienced staff. So, induction training, what are the priorities? The priorities of each lab are different. You can have a push towards ultimately quality, or you can push towards making the work cheap, we can push towards having a large quantity of work going through the lab. As the old joke goes, you can pick any two of those. It's very hard to do all three without severely compromising. Induction training is also about supervision, who your supervisor is, who you report to, when you can carry out additional training for equipment and procedures. It's also about using PPE, when and where, and why you have to use PPE. It does tend to give a degree of importance to procedures, and we'll speak more about that later. And of course, above all else, in most mine site labs, it's about safety. So, importance of induction training. It's based on common sense. Unfortunately, as the old saying goes, another old saying, not that common. It's about staff attitudes, making sure that quality and safety are kept to the level required. Excuse me. Producing acceptable behaviour in all your staff and following the company policies. These things are very important to mine site labs. They have definite policies for most things. And it's about respect for all rules. So the induction training tends to look at general topics of discussion and make sure you understand how those fit into the work you're going to do. Specific training, obviously it's about an operation of equipment, efficient use of resources. Those two are paramount in any lab. It's also about instrument longevity. We don't want to be having machines break down 6 months after they're installed because of corrosion and so on. So it's also about consistent QA, QC. We don't want people rejecting data that might be acceptable to somebody else and vice versa. And one of the things that the LIMS in any lab does is address those things. You can set that up in the LIMS. The LIMS can do the grunt work for the quality control, or at least quality assurance anyway. And then final sign-offs can be done by various people once they're trained. It's also about safe operating principles. We don't want to be turning nitrous oxide on and trying to light the flame with nitrous oxide and an AA. And of course, it's about getting the right data. Nobody sets out to get the wrong data in the lab. People forget that, I think, but it's generally speaking, people want to get the right data. They want to produce the goods. It's whether or not they follow all the list of above items that'll happen or not. Can staff take specific training notes? No, it's not acceptable to take notes. They become uncontrolled documents. If staff are taking notes, then they're obviously struggling to grasp the ideas, and the ideas must be made simpler. We also, if the task is long and complex, we also need to be able to have those procedures in the lab to make sure that people can actually follow them as per a recipe book. So we don't want to be taking notes. The number of times I go to labs and we find random specific methods written on walls or tacked to walls with yellowed paper that's obviously been there for several years, bearing no relation to the actual procedure in the manual, and there's no manual in the lab. The procedures are generally kept in the office and under lock and key virtually. So we've got to keep those manuals out in the lab, and we need to keep records of where they are and how often they're being updated. And we also need to keep training records for staff that have carried out that work, carried out that training. So it's very important that these things are all done within the lab. And of course, once you update something, you have to have a system in place. You need to be able to get that update out to the lab, excuse me, out to the lab, make sure staff read it, make sure they're signed off on it. So all this is a system in place. It needs to operate smoothly. So you've got your staff inducted and trained. There's no other work to do, is there? Well, no, there is. The induction procedures are the laws of the lab. They need to be abided by. Excuse me. So they've got to be indoctrinated. The people have to realise that these procedures and inductions cannot be changed without validation. We often find that lab staff make small changes to procedures that they think will not be noticed and they believe makes the procedure more efficient. But often these things are not validated. So they need to be validated. If there are any kind of major change, they must be validated every time. And they need to be reviewed regularly, at least once a year for your procedures. Make sure that they're reviewed and signed off that they're reviewed. Many mine site labs don't do that. The other thing you need to do is check compliance. This is often missed at mine sites. Staff are trained once and left to their own devices. I would recommend every 3 months that you assess staff for specific tasks. It's not likely that they will make mistakes within 3 months, but if they're left not checked at any time, they will be making changes and making mistakes after that period of time. Changes are not allowed, and you must have a failure system in place. Failure system might be something like read the procedure again and go back and redo it and be reassessed. These sort of things are imperative in any lab. Otherwise, changes will take place and you won't be aware of them. Records. You need lots of records. There must be records of every bit of training you've done, be it chemical training, induction, training, specific training for procedures or equipment. You've got to keep records of everything and update them as required. For the purposes of consistent training, I would always recommend, excuse me, always recommend that you have documents to carry out your training. If you don't have documents, chances are you're going to train people differently at some point in time, especially after you've trained 10 or 15 staff. In any laboratory, quality is always questioned, amongst other things, of course. But if you have records of what's been taught to people, how they've been trained, what work they've been doing, how the work looks, then you have at least some answers to those questions. And also when when staff are staff are trained properly and the work's going well, they'll be more confident in their work and they'll do it better. What else? Again, procedures are the foundation of any laboratory. You must have procedures. You must abide by those procedures. You cannot have people changing procedures. So therefore, if you have procedures, they must be available to staff. They must be in the lab, they must be controlled, and people must be using them. If you're baking 25 different types of cake, you're going to need those procedures for every one of those cakes. You can't go off memory. The other thing with procedures, they must be fit for purpose. It's no good having a procedure if it doesn't do the job. If you want a selective copper analysis, it's no good having a total copper method in place or procedure. You have to control those procedures, as I mentioned above, and review them regularly. If people are struggling with them, simplify them, make them simpler, make people understand what's going on, and give them the procedure so they can have it there when they're doing the work. And review your training documents, of course. No good changing the procedure and having your training documents still operating off the old procedure.